Hey builders, Matt from Build That Website here, and today we're going to be building these two product callouts using nothing but the free version of GenerateBlocks. If you want a copy of these blocks for yourself, you can download them using the free link in the video description. However, I do highly recommend that you actually take the time to build them along with me because you're going to learn so much about the new Flexbox layout features of GenerateBlocks and Gutenberg in general, as well as some important concepts around spacing and responsive design. So if you're ready, give this video a quick like and let's get building. Now, before we start building, it's a good idea to plan the structure of your blocks first. And there's two things we want to think about. First, we want to think about what we should use as the Flex children. And when working with Flexbox, especially when you're in a row layout like you're often going to be on desktop, you want to think about each section of this card design as a separate column. So here's 1, 2, 3. And as you can see, one of these, the middle column, actually has multiple elements in it. So we need to make sure that we're using a container around this one. As just a general practice, I tend to like to use a container around each of my Flex items, and then you can put whatever content you want inside those containers. Now, the second thing we want to think about is how this is going to collapse on mobile. And I think the easiest design to do would be this, where we can naturally just stack it and maybe change the alignment of the elements, but they're all in the same order. Now I'm here inside a demo post and I like to design in the content template where I'm going to use these blocks so that way I can see how they're going to look on a container that's the same size as my blog posts. So let's start building the structure. When working with GenerateBlocks, it's good to have the block navigator open so you can see the structure and easily hop between blocks. And to start adding blocks, you can just hit the /, and if you just start typing GenerateBlocks, it'll show you all the GenerateBlocks that are available. And we're just going to start with an outer container here. And we don't need an inner container. This isn't a full width row layout. And then we're going to add some child elements. And like I said, I like to use a container for each of the Flex items inside a Flex container as well. So let's add 3 more containers. And we'll just duplicate and duplicate. Now we can start adding the content. So in this first one, we need an image. And I'll use the GenerateBlocks image. For the second block, we're going to grab 2 headlines, and I'll just duplicate that. And we'll call that the subheadline. And then in the last container, we just need a button. And once again, I'm going to use the GenerateBlocks button. And while it doesn't look like much, this is all the structure we need to build this callout. So let's quickly do some styling. So for the image, because of the size and height of our design, I think it makes sense to use the thumbnail, which I believe is 150 by 150 square by default. And we could even set a smaller fixed size if we want. So we can say, for example, 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And before we start styling the rest, let's actually set up the Flex container and get this layout looking closer to how it will eventually. So the first thing we do is in this container, under layout, and this again is the outer container here, we're going to change the display from default to Flex. And by default, that will make it a row-based Flex layout. As you can see here, the Flex direction by default is row, column, row. And while it's not properly styled yet, you can see that the layout is basically exactly what we have in the finished design. Next, we'll give it a background color just so we can see sort of the outer boundaries of our card and a little bit border radius. Next, we'll give it some spacing all the way around. And in general, it's better practice to start with too much spacing and try to back it down instead of adding spacing until it looks like it's just enough. This is a good rule of thumb that has served me pretty well. This is probably going to end up being too much, but we'll fine tune it as we go. Next, we'll style the headlines. And right now it's just inheriting the styles from my theme, but we're going to make this smaller text size, make it a bit bolder. We'll make this subheadline even smaller. I'll throw in some placeholder text, and we need to get rid of the default spacing that is being inherited from my theme. So let's just try 4 pixels right there. And then the second headline, I don't want any margin on the bottom at all. Now, next up, we want to vertically center this content in our card. And with Flexbox, that's super easy. We're just going to go to the Flex container here, and under the align items, that's what aligns it on the cross axis, which in this case is the vertical axis. We're just going to click center, and that's going to pop everything down. Next up, we just need to get the spacing right. And there's a couple ways to do this. One way to do this is just with the column gap property of the Flex container. So we could, for example, just add 20 pixels of column gap. That's easy enough. And I think I want to dial down the sizing of this image even more, so we could try 75 pixels. Next, we'll style this button to make it more closely match the prototype that I built. So we'll change the default color to a very dark blue. And under spacing, we're going to adjust the padding. Let's try something closer to this. And we're going to give it a mid-width. Under sizing, you can give things a mid-width. And we'll just say 120 pixels. And we're going to center the text. And how do I do that? They move the settings here. Because it's set to inline flex, I guess I can just use its own flex box settings there. And we'll give it a border radius as well. Link that all the way around. And just a couple last tweaks here. This button is actually being left aligned, I believe, in its container. And if we want to change that, I would like to push it all the way to the far side of the container. There's a couple ways we could do this. One way, I believe, would be to switch the justify content property of the parent to space between. Let's see what that does. And now it's going to push that to the end. And that's looking pretty good. If we go to this middle container here with the text, and we can go to the flex child properties, and we're going to set flex grow to 1. That means it's going to expand to fill all the available space. So that will keep that closer here to the logo and push the buy button to the end. And that is about the look that I'm going for. And if you want to recreate this sort of boxed white background look that we have in the prototype here, we can add some styling to the container. So let's give the container max width and height. And we're going to give it some padding as well. We'll say 8 pixels all the way around, link that, and a background color of white. Now you can see the image is overflowing the container. That's because we gave it a fixed size larger than the container. So let's go back, undo that fixed size, select the object fit to contain. The image is going to fit in the container. And finally, we can add a subtle border to that container of the image too. So let's go to border. 1 pixel. We'll give it a border radius as well. We'll try 4 pixels. And for the border color, it's going to be tough to see, but we're going to give it just a light gray. I think we're pretty close here. On the parent container, I want to add a tiny amount of additional right padding. So we're going to unlink that. And so first, I think we do have too much spacing. I think we're going to back it down to maybe 15 pixels all the way around. But on the right, I want to up that to 20 just to give a little more space for the button over there. And now if we preview that on the front end, I think that looks quite good, quite professional. Next up, let's just quickly set up the mobile layout. So to do that, we're just going to click on the mobile preview here. And as you can see, it looks quite hideous. It's still being forced to stack into a row layout there. All we have to do is change the flex direction to column on mobile, and it's already looking better. And then now we just need to tweak the spacing. Now you can see on the design I've done, I think it looks best if everything's centered like this, but you could also try it left aligned if you like. So the easiest way to first do this is instead of having a column gap, we're just going to set up a row gap. And let's just try 20 pixels to start. I think I want a bit more margin under the image here. So let's just say 15 more pixels of margin there. For the middle container, we can go to the text line property here and we'll just click align text center. And then under our button here, I think we want to make it full width instead of giving it mid width. So let us just display block. Let's see, did that work? By default, a flex item will only be as wide as its content when it's in flex direction column. So we just need to make this full width. Let's change the width property down here to 100%. And now we can change the button also to be 100%. Let's see, what is the button displayed as? Let's make it display block. There we go. One final thing I forgot to do is you actually want to add a bit of spacing to the outside of this block as well. You can see that the next block is going to be right underneath this. So maybe we can just add some margin top and bottom, and we'll say, I don't know, 25 pixels of margin top and bottom just to clear some space. And we can start working on our next CTA. So let's take a look. And this is a pretty simple layout. If it gets down to it, it's just one column here and a second column here. It's not quite 50-50 in my design. It's closer to 60-40, but you can make it whatever you want. And we've got a little badge up here. So let's start building our 2-column layout first. Now with GenerateBlocks, there's two ways you could design this. You can do it with pure flexbox, as we did the previous card, or you could just do the grid layout and just choose a two column grid to get started with. That's especially helpful if you're not that familiar with Flexbox yet. You're not quite sure how the intricacies work. But because I do want to help you guys get some practice in, I'm going to use another Flexbox container. So we'll just have an outer container here. Again, let me remind you of my rule that I like each column, 1, 2, to be inside a container as the flex item. We're going to set up 2 inner columns as well. So let's add another container. And we can duplicate that. As far as content, we need a headline, subheadline, text, and a button. So we can probably just grab them from here. I'm just going to duplicate this. And I'm going to move it down to this first container. Can be a little tricky there to get stuff where you're trying to get it to go. I'll duplicate this subheadline and drag it on down. And I'll duplicate this button and drag it right in here. And we could duplicate the subheadline one more time to make our body text. Then down here, we've got our image, and that should be everything we need. Everything else is just styling. So first, let's get our Flexbox set up. We're going to go to Display Flex. And as you can see, since we have 2 flex items, we got 1 flex column there, other flex column there. And because I like to really see the container that I'm working with, I like to set up either a background or a border first. So we're going to add our border. Let's try 4 pixels to start. And our border color, we're going to use the one from the design. Next up, let's add some spacing. Don't forget spacing, guys. It's very important. And it's always better to err on the side of having a little bit too much spacing rather than too little, because that tends to make your designs look amateurish. So let's start with about 25 pixels of spacing all the way around, and we can tweak from there. Next, I'm going to swap out the content. And we can get started styling. Now, I think this headline here looks pretty good as a start. You might want to switch out the heading element. You can make it whatever you want, but I think the font size looks pretty good. Next, I want this subheadline to be a bit bigger. Let's try 18 pixels on for size. And I do think, actually, because I'm zoomed in, I do want to make this font size a little bit bigger. So we'll try 22 pixels. And I'm going to make this, I'm going to make that italic. Very importantly, I want to put some spacing under this one, and that's why I like to use the headline element, because it has very good spacing controls. So let's try 15 pixels of space under that. And before we tweak too much more, I want to get my sizing right. Now you can see that this image is only taking up sort of its intrinsic size here, but we want to get something closer to this layout. Now, there's a couple ways to handle the sizing of these columns. For example, you could set explicit widths, perhaps based on percentages. You could use 60-40. But when working with images, I actually like to define the size that I want the image to be, and then just let the text content expand to fill the available space. We could go to our container for our image here, for example, and under the sizing properties, we could just say mid-width 210 pixels. Let's try that. And then to make sure we have proper spacing around here, we can add some padding around this container as well. We'll do 20 pixels of padding around the image as well. And of course, we probably need a little bit more spacing between our text column and the image. And we can do that either with the flex gap property on the container. So that'd be the column gap. We could try adding 25 pixels. And now that I'm eyeballing this layout, I do feel like we need a little bit more spacing in our box here. So just under our parent container here, I think I'm going to make it 30 pixels of padding all the way around. And we actually need to, just to make this fit better on larger screens, I think I need to up the font sizes a little bit. And we just want to make sure that we have proper spacing. So on this middle headline here, I'm going to give it some margin top and bottom, just to push our button down. And just to get all our content aligned in the center where we want it, in our flex parent here, let me collapse this other one so I don't keep clicking it. We can just go to Align Items Center, and it'll push everything down. All that's left here is to style our button. Let's give it a background color here and change its text color. A good way to do text colors for buttons, if you didn't notice, is you can just darken the background color and it'll usually be a good contrast color while also matching. And I'll also adjust the typography. I'm just going to increase the font weight here. And under sizing, let's give it a min width. We'll say 160 pixels. I think that looks pretty good. Before we finalize the responsive settings, I want to add that badge, this badge that we had here. And typically I would do this with CSS myself because that's something that's really easy for me, but I know that a lot of you are not comfortable with CSS. So let's do this the Gutenberg no code way. So the first thing we want to do is I want to actually take this container and put it inside another outer container. Now in some page builders, you could go here and like say wrap with container. And I wish that feature be added to Gutenberg blocks. Maybe sometime in the future, we'll get that from GenerateBlocks. But for the meantime, it can be kind of a finicky process. But the first thing we're going to do is going to go add new, and we're just going to make this a container here. And you may find that if you try to, if you try to drag this content into this container, it can be hard to do. But you can see there, it should be going in there, and that did it. I'm going to undo that. If you have trouble dragging one container into another empty container, one trick is just to add a little bit of text or any sort of content in there. And then now it can be easier to drag it inside the container than just delete the text. Now, once we have that, I'm actually going to label these just so we can see visually what we're working with in the navigator, so I don't get confused. So we're just going to say CTA inner. We'll call that the CTA inner, and we'll just call this the 2-column CTA. And we're going to make a new container in here. And this is going to be the badge. So we'll go down to the event section here, and we're just going to call this the CTA badge. And inside here, we're going to add a new headline block. And we're just going to say, you can put whatever text you want in here. I'm going to say most portable. Next, we're going to grab this border color and make it a background. So under typography here, we'll give it a background of that and a text color of white. We also need to get rid of that bottom margin so there's no space between it and that inner content. I'm going to drop the font size down to maybe something like 19 or perhaps 20. We'll try that and give it a font weight of 500. And now you can see it's still taking up the whole top bar here. And that might be a look that you like. So we could, for example, add 5 pixels of padding and maybe some padding on the left and right. And that would look good to you. You can keep that as it is. That's a nice boxed look. If you want to get that inline tab style look that we have, you just have to change this display from the default, which is block, to either inline block or inline flex. So we'll go inline flex, and you can see that now this is only the width of the actual inner content. So that's the headline itself plus the padding. And finally, I'm just going to adjust the border radius, and I only want it on the top left and the top right just to make that kind of rounded look there. And you don't even need that, but that is just the look that I personally am going for. And that's pretty much done. I think we would also want to add some spacing on the outer container here. So here's our 2-column CTA, and I would just put some margin, we'll say 30 pixels above and below, just to get proper spacing from everything else. And the final thing here is just to make sure this looks good on all screen sizes. So we're just going to tweak the responsiveness. And if you see in your browser, I'm going to squeeze the screen here, and as it gets smaller, you can see that little period where it kind of gets knocked out of the box. That doesn't look good, so we're going to have to fix that. We could just make it stack earlier, and this is partially a quirk of my own site or this demo site where the container actually gets quite narrow here for the content container. And a lot of you guys are going to get rid of the sidebar a lot earlier than this. So you could probably live with that or fix it. And you can see that there's some weirdness here. Now this is sort of the mobile settings. So let's fix all that nonsense. So the first thing we're going to do is go back to our inner container here, and we're just going to change the tablet look. And I think maybe we'll just change the size of this this container here. What have we set it to? We give it a min width and a max width. I'm going to set the min width to 140 pixels and a max width to we'll say 30% of the container. And I also want to give this button a max width. So right now we've set it we're going to change the min width. I'm going to say maybe 200 pixels. I'm just going to give it a max width of 100%. So it can never be bigger than 100% of its container. And I think those two things should already fix our issues. And the next thing we want to do is just make sure that this stacks on mobile, because right now it still has that display flex where they're side by side. Obviously we need them to stack. So let's go back here and we're just going to change on mobile the flex direction to column. And I think that does most of the hard work for us. Now the problem here is that the image is on the bottom because it's the second block in our 2-column layout. But Flexbox to the rescue again. There's a handy feature of Flexbox, which is the reverse feature. So you can either have the row reverse layout or you can have the column reverse layout. And in GenerateBlocks, all you have to do is toggle this reverse option right here, and that will put the roadie cooler at the top, but just for that view. So it'll be normal on desktop and tablet. And then when you get to the mobile breakpoint, it's going to reverse it and put that cooler on top. And I don't really think we have to do much tweaking at all here. I guess the only things I would touch are I would probably put a little bit of margin here under our image. And we do need to change the centering of the text on our button. Oh, one final tweak I want to make is just have this, this container here. I just want to align that to center on mobile. I think pop that into the center. I think that makes more sense there. All right, so those are our 2 CTAs. I think they look pretty good. Now, if you're ready to take these designs to the next level, make sure to check out this video right over here, where I show you how to combine GenerateBlocks with the power of the query loop and advanced custom fields to create incredible, reusable, dynamic designs powered by your database. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Let's go.